You're looking good. I think I'm older than you. You okay?
No power was today either. How do I?
I believe in advocacy.
True. Morning, everybody. It's good to see you this morning. You may recall last week in our Bible class, we introduced the subject of the promises that God makes that we find in the Scriptures. And among other things, we pointed out last week that the promises we find in the Scriptures made by God are generally positive. They're not typically limited in their scope. And as much as anything, they're harmonious in their design. They work together. God works things together. Now, there's a fourth point from last week that we didn't quite get to, just sort of touched it slightly, and then our time ran out. And I want to come back to that before we finish up today, and that is that even though God's promises are typically positive and they're generally unlimited or typically not limited in their scope, and they're harmonious in their design, they are often restricted or limited in their application. And we'll come back to that. We'll get to that. But before we do, let me ask you a thought question. Something to sort of toy with and play with for the next couple of minutes. Why do you think God makes promises? Why would you think God would even make promises to us? I would suggest that to answer that question, one of the things we need to do is give some thought to what a promise is. And that's what I'd like for us to do this morning, along with considering who and what the components of a promise typically are. What's a promise? Okay, Hugh says a statement of something that will be accomplished if certain items or certain conditions are met. Okay, that's. Don't eat the apple or don't eat the fruit. Very first promise. If you do that, here's what's going to happen, and you're not going to like it. Okay, that's kind of a business world legal definition, and it's actually a very practical one. Take your Bible and turn to Exodus chapter 12, and you find not the first promise in the Bible, but the first explicit biblical reference to a promise. Now we know in Exodus chapter 11 we have the 10 commandments, or Exodus chapter 20 rather, we have the 10 commandments laid down. So this is substrate or background for that giving of the 10 commandments. In the 10 commandments we have what Peter calls the first commandment with promise. Honor your father and mother that your days may be long upon the earth. Well, back here in Exodus chapter 12, what do you find in verse 25? Moses, speaking for God, is telling the children of Israel, here's what's going to happen. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, that you shall keep this service. They're talking about the Passover, talking about the observance of these things, and the instruction is when you get there, you keep doing this because God is fulfilling his promise when you get there. Well, what promise is he talking about? There you go. There you go. It goes back to God's promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. The tripart or three-part promise. I'll make a great nation of you. I'll give you descendants. I'll make a great nation of you. All nations of the earth will be blessed. I'll give you this land in which to dwell. And all nations will be blessed through you. But this particular instruction, do this when you get there, relates to what? Passover. Well, what was the purpose of the Passover observance or the Passover service in ancient Israel? Exactly. It was a memorial for what?
For the death of their firstborn son and to remember that he meant what he said.
Okay. It memorialized, actually it was the death of the Egyptians' firstborn. It reminded the Israelites we were spared that, and God delivered us. God provided for us. Well, why did God deliver them? Why did God provide? Why did he spare their firstborn in that night and so forth? Because that was part of fulfilling that promise that he'd made to Abraham. I'll give you this land for you and your descendants. Now, Abraham got to live in that land. Get up, leave Ur of the Chaldees, go through Haran, leave Haran, go to the land I'll show you. He settled around Shechem, lived out most of the rest of his life there. His children saw it. Some of them were born there, some of his grandchildren. And then they moved to Egypt, Joseph's day. But even so, what was the promise? They'll come back. Now, it took 430 years before they got back. But God fulfilled his promise and gave them that land. Look at 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 56 there. Now, in 1 Kings chapter 8, we have come forward hundreds of years. We're down to the time of the kings. Israel has settled in the promised land. They've lived through the 350 or 400 so years of the judges, and they have come now to the point of having kings in the land. Saul has reigned 40 years, David has reigned 40 years, and now Solomon is on the throne. And Solomon has done what David wanted to do but was not allowed, which is to build a temple for the Lord there in Jerusalem. So in 1 Kings chapter 8, now we have the dedication service for the temple, the initial service and prayer and so forth associated with the building of the temple. And notice in verse 56, Solomon praises God specifically for fulfilling or for keeping his promises to Israel. Blessed be the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel according to all that he promised. He's done everything he promised, in other words. There has not failed one word of all his good promise, which he promised through his servant Moses. Now that's actually a lot like Joshua's words at the end of his life in Joshua chapters 23 and 24, where he tells the greatest generation in Israel, the conquering generation, you're here, you're in the land, God has given it to you, you have taken possession of it, God has kept his promise. So it goes back to what Hugh said a minute ago. What is a promise? It's a statement that these conditions or these circumstances will come about if these conditions are fulfilled, if these situations are met. What had God promised to Israel? I'll give you this land. You'll live in houses you didn't build. You'll have vineyards you didn't plant and fields you didn't cultivate. You'll live in a land of milk and honey. Now, why do you think Solomon would think God deserved praise for having kept his promises, for having done this? Okay, well, Solomon himself was, generally speaking, he's a man of his word. He could appreciate that quality in others, including God. Think about the time and the environment in which these people lived as well. All the nations that surrounded Israel in the land of promise. Who did the Moabites worship? Who did the Philistines worship? Who did the Edomites worship, and so forth? Well, the Moabites, Ammonites, and the Amorites, and all the folks over to the east tended to worship deities like Moloch and Chemosh and so forth that were arbitrary and harsh and not particularly interested in the well-being of their supposed people.
They never fulfilled any promises.
And they didn't actually fulfill any promises. Things that worked to the advantage of these different peoples were coincidental, not providential. Think about the Philistines over on the west side on the Mediterranean coast. Who was their god? In the days of David, it was Dagon. Go back to the days of King Saul, and Saul and the Israelites brought the Ark of the Covenant out to use in battle like it's some kind of a lucky charm, and the Philistines captured it. And they put it in the house of Dagon, their god, a fish god, a man's body with a fish head. And time after time, the image of Dagon was found on its face in front of the Ark of the Covenant until they finally said, "We got to get this thing out of here." Dagon couldn't do diddly for his people. As the Israelites looked around at the society, the cultures, the religions around them, one of the things that they could see, and any of the Canaanite people around them that paid attention, one of the things that they could see was that Israel's God kept his promises, where their gods didn't, and their priests had to try to explain why they didn't sometimes. Go back to the book of Joshua and think about the words of Rahab down there about Joshua chapter 5, chapter 6. The words of Rahab to the spies or the surveyors that Joshua had sent into the land. What did she tell them about the attitude of the people in Jericho as Israel is encamped at Gilgal right there by the Jordan River? We know who you are. We know where you came from. We know why you're here, to take our territory. And we know who is on your side. And what else? We're scared to death of you. Why were they scared to death of the Israelites? Because God, who had delivered them out of slavery in Egypt that the Canaanites and the people of Jericho knew about, was on their side, was in there, it was favored them. More than that, if they were paying attention, they knew what God told Israel about conquering the promised land. And what did he say? He didn't say, you go in and you do this all on your own. He said, I will fight for you. Now, Israel had a job to do. They had a responsibility to fulfill. In fact, we've talked about in the past how they did not actually obtain some of the territory they could have had because they stopped short. But the shortcoming was Israel, not God. Sometimes when we don't have some of the blessings that we could have, it's not on God, it's on us. So when Solomon praises God for keeping his promises, he's looking at, thinking about, speaking to people who could do the same thing, that they look all around them and they see only the God of heaven. Of all of the entities that people worship, only the God actually consistently keeps his promises. Well, let's ask another question. What makes up a promise? Now, Hugh talked about this a minute ago. What makes up a promise? Well, there's some conditions to be fulfilled, and there's some things offered in exchange for that. For there to be a promise, though, there are at least two parties involved. Now, Hugh, have you ever promised yourself something? Yeah. It says at his age, you can't remember. I expect he has. Charles, I know you have. You've promised yourself something at one time or another. Who are the two parties there? Well, I and me, basically. But we understand in the workings of a promise, there are two parties involved, at least two. There's the one who makes the promise, and there's the one who receives the promise. So what do we know about the nature of a promise? Well, on the one hand, there's what we might call a declaration of performance by the one that makes the promise. If this happens, if you do this, or if this circumstance comes to pass, then I will do, or maybe not do, thus and such and so and so. There's a statement by the one that makes the promise. Here's what the result will be if these circumstances take place. Is it possible to make an unrestricted promise? No obligations, no requirements. Certainly. You can get yourself in trouble really quickly doing that. I promise that I will do thus and such and so and so. No restrictions, no conditions, no nothing. Well, sometimes that can come back and bite you. You don't think it through. There's usually some what we might call added element, some assurance or some guarantee that the promise will be fulfilled. The Hebrews writer tells us, for example, that God strengthened his promise with an oath, a vow. And because he could swear by no one greater than himself, who did he swear by? He swore by himself. So he added an oath, and in that context, the oath or the vow is basically a promise, if you will, of condemnation of some bad consequence if the promise itself is not fulfilled. Now, promises can also be strengthened or reinforced by giving a surety or some kind of collateral. Look at Genesis chapter 43 and verses 8 and 9. In Genesis chapter 43 now, we have Abraham dealing with his 11 remaining sons. He does not yet know that Joseph is still alive in Egypt, much less that he's the number 2 man in the whole nation. And his sons have been to Egypt to buy grain, come back, they're ready to go again, but before they can go, there's a condition that Joseph, who they have not known yet, they don't know who he is, Joseph has put a condition on them. If you come back to me, you have to bring the youngest child with you. That's Benjamin. Why would Joseph be interested in Benjamin? Well, that's his only full-blood brother, son of the same mother and father. That's the only brother, seemingly, who was not involved in any way in Joseph being kidnapped by his own brethren and sold into slavery in Egypt, separated from the company and the fellowship of his father for 20-odd years. You have to bring him with you if you come back. And Abraham is extremely resistant to that idea. But now they're about to starve to death, so the only option they have besides starving is go back to Egypt and buy more grain. And Judah said to Israel, his father, I said Abraham, Jacob rather, not Abraham. I've been saying Abraham all this time, meaning Jacob. My apologies. Judah said to Israel, or Jacob, his father, send the lad, meaning Benjamin, with me. And we will arise and go that we may live and not die, both we and you, and also our little ones. But now look at verse 9. I myself will be surety. I'll be the collateral for him. From my hand you will require him. If something happens to Benjamin, I'll pay the penalty for it. If I don't bring him back to you and set him before you, then you let me bear the blame forever. I'll take the responsibility for it. It was more than Jacob could bear almost to think that he might lose the only remaining son, is in his perspective, of his most beloved, Rachel. From his perspective, he's already lost Joseph, who had been the favored son. If I send Benjamin, I'm taking a risk. I'll have nothing left of her. I'll be the collateral for him. Now, I talked about God strengthening promises with an oath a minute ago. And there's often a distinction in the scriptures between a promise and an oath or a vow. With an oath, there's typically an additional degree of guarantee or assurance. Some unpleasant consequence that is stated if this does not come to pass. You look at Genesis chapter 50 and verse 25. You have a conditional promise there. In Genesis chapter 50, Joseph, ruler over all of Egypt under Pharaoh, is now old. He's at the end of his life, basically. And he takes an oath, a promise, a guarantee from the children of Israel. He makes them swear to him. See, a promise in this context is typically voluntary. An oath may be imposed, and that's kind of what we have going on here in Genesis chapter 50. It's required. Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, verse 25, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. It's going to be 400 more years, basically, until they leave Egypt. But when you go, don't you leave my carcass here. You take my bones back to the land that God promised and bury them there. Go back to 1 Kings for a minute. 1 Kings chapter 8. And in that same context where Solomon is praising God for all that he has done and the construction of the temple and God's Spirit inhabiting the new temple and so forth, there in verses 31 and 32, Solomon describes an oath that's strengthened or magnified, you might say, by involving God as a witness, invoking God as a witness to the obligation that the promise involves. When anyone sins against his neighbor and is forced, meaning forced by the law, by the authorities, is forced to take an oath and comes and takes an oath before your altar in this temple. All right, let's pause here and think about this situation. Someone in Israel has committed a crime of some sort, done wrong in some way. It's been made known. There's been a discussion, a trial of sorts. The judges have adjudicated this and they've said, all right, here's what's fair for you who have done wrong to restore to this person this and this and this. Maybe it's something specified in the law. Here's what the law says. You have to restore this plus 20%, typically. All right, well, I don't have the ability to do that right here on the spot. I took the animal and I slaughtered it. I can't very well restore it. All right, well, you owe this man a new animal plus. When anyone sins against his neighbor and is forced or is required to take an oath and comes and takes that oath before your altar in this temple, here's the condition that multiplies or magnifies that, verse 32. Then, Lord, hear in heaven and act and judge your servants, condemning the wicked, bringing his way on his head, and justifying the righteous by giving him according to his righteousness. Now, let's think about this from the outside looking in human perspective for just a second. And to do that, let's go back chronologically to about the time of Abraham and Job and think about the conditions of Job. Who is Job? Patriarch, a servant of God, extraordinary for his faithfulness and his commitment. He was also abundantly, richly blessed by God, greatest of all the ancient men of the East, basically. Flocks and herds and 10 camels and 10 kids. Wealth, extraordinary by that ancient times standard and probably by today's standard as well. And faithful, exceptional for his faithfulness. And what happens? Well, we know what happens. Job chapters 1 and 2, discussions between God and Satan and God giving permission. All right, you can afflict him. Okay, you can go farther. Just don't kill him. Does Job know any of that? Not as far as we can tell. As far as the scripture reveals, Job not only didn't know then, Job never knew why all these things happened. But his friends come, and as we've often said, the very best thing they did was they sat with him for a week and just sat there, kept him company, and then they started talking, and it went downhill really quick from there. Because all they had to say is, what? His wife says, why are you going through this? Why don't you just curse God and die? But his friends, over and over, their whole discussion, and it degenerates into an argument basically in about 30 seconds time. Their whole contention, all three of them is, you must have done something wrong. You must be responsible for this. You must have caused this. This has to be God's judgment for some horrible, horrible sin or stack of sins that you've committed. And of course, Job protests, I may not be perfect, but fellas, I didn't do anything to merit this kind of retribution. And he was right. He was absolutely right. He hadn't done anything from the human perspective to deserve the things that he suffered. But from that time, that ancient time, right down to the New Testament era, what was the general outlook of God's people where someone who suffered some hardship or difficulty or problem was concerned? Yeah, somehow it's connected to sin. That's right, Joan. Go to John chapter 9, and in John chapter 9, here's Jesus with his disciples, and they see a man in John chapter 9, verse 1. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. Now, how did they know he was blind from birth? I don't think he was wearing a sign that says, I was born blind. Probably that's a detail that John gives us by inspiration, not something that they necessarily knew in the moment, other than Jesus, obviously. But look at verse 2. The disciples asked him, Master, who sinned that this man should be born blind? Him or his parents? And we've talked about that. It's kind of almost a comical image that the man himself could have sinned so that he was born blind. Well, he had to sin in his mother's womb. But the point is that they looked on this man's disability or misfortune or suffering, however you want to describe it, and the conclusion they came to was exactly the same as Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar 1,500 years in the past, in the days of Abraham and Job, where Job's sufferings were concerned. Somebody must have caused this, and it could have been you. Well, when anyone sins, 1 Kings chapter 8, against his neighbor, has to take an oath, takes that oath before your altar in this temple, verse 32, Lord, you hear and act accordingly and condemn the wicked and justify the right. It's interesting. You don't find any examples that just stand out in the scriptures of someone looking at another man's prosperity and blessings and goodness and saying, clearly this is a righteous man because God is blessing him. In fact, what's one of the questions that Jeremiah puts to God in the Old Testament? Lord, why do the wicked prosper? It's kind of a one-way street from the human perspective. But let's get back to some of the promises of God. And we could look at different examples of those things, different illustrations. In Genesis chapter 3, you go back to the Garden of Eden. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, in the aftermath of disobedience, what do you find? It's veiled. It's not explicit in all of its glory, as it were. But in Genesis 3 and verse 15, you find the first promise of a Savior to remedy the problem of sin. God speaks to the serpent, Satan in physical form of some sort, and says, the seed of woman will crush your head. The seed of woman, the descendant, singular seed of woman will deal a mortal blow to your power. Now, from Genesis 3 all the way down to the crucifixion, what happens? People live in fear of death, in fear of consequences. And people still live in fear of consequences, not because they have to, but because they don't take advantage of what the Lord has done. The promise in that verse, you'll bruise his heel, he'll bruise your head. The consequences of that promise apply to whom? Every one of us. They apply to Satan on the one hand, but the benefit applies to every one of us. Breaking his power, what does that offer us? Freedom, liberty, release, reassurance. What about Genesis chapter 8? Flip over to Genesis chapter 8 and look at verses 21 and 22, and then look down at chapter 9. In Genesis chapter 8, in verses 21 and 22, God made a promise. An offering is made. This is in the aftermath of what event? What takes place in Genesis chapter 6 and 7 and the first part of chapter 8? The flood. You've got Noah and the great big barge and the flood, and all the people die except Noah and Mrs. Noah and Ham and Mrs. Ham and Shem and Mrs. Shem and Japheth and Mrs. Japheth and the animals that were in the ark and things that could swim. And the ark comes to rest on Mount Ararat, and after about 6 months the water goes down enough that they can actually open the door and go outside. And Noah offers a sacrifice to the Lord. The Lord smelled a soothing aroma. And the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night shall not cease. We're going to keep on having seasons, and yes, they cycle up and they cycle down, and it gets unusually hot in Portland and Seattle and places like that this year, and it won't maybe next year. But day and night and all of these things will not cease as long as time stands. We really don't have to worry about the earth becoming a scorched, barren, gigantic asteroid floating around. As long as the earth remains, it'll be habitable. But then jump down to chapter 9. Not only does God promise that the universe will continue to function as he created it to in chapter 8, but then in chapter 9, verses 9 through 17, specifically verse 13, God says, not only am I not going to do this again, I'll give you a sign to guarantee that. I will set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. I'm not going to flood the earth like this ever again. Now, there are still floods in various places, but they don't cover the whole world. They don't destroy all of life on the face of the earth, basically. They're localized, where that was global. That was judgment. These are simply consequences of the climate. And sometimes human activity as well, in the way we contour the ground and so forth. Flip a couple of pages to chapter 12. Look at verses 1, 2, and 3 in Genesis. And now we get to a very familiar promise. To whom did God make this promise? Genesis chapter 12. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation and bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the nations or all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, God was speaking to one man, Abram. But who does that promise affect? Every one of us, one way or another. Either we are heirs according to the promise, Galatians chapter 3, seed of Abraham, children of Abraham, and we receive the blessings associated with that, or we're not, and we miss out on the blessings associated with that. So it affects every living soul one way or another. You go over to Hebrews chapter 6, and we were talking about oaths a while ago. God makes promises to mankind. Why would he? Why does he? Well, so he can keep them, so he can demonstrate his faithfulness. But why else does God make promises to mankind? In one sense, it's a form of contract between God and us, a form of covenant between us. Creates hope. Now, most of us in the course of our lives have been involved in financial transactions of some sort that involved the lending of money. And for most of us, the lending part has been on the part of somebody else, and we're the borrower end of that. We're the one promising to pay it back. When you sign that contract, I promise to repay this. You're putting your name and your credit and your reputation and maybe the title to your car or the title to your house or something like that on the line, aren't you? You're putting up something of value as collateral. But let's reverse that for just a second and let's put ourselves in the position of being the lender for just a second. Now, if I'm going to lend Wayne $1 million, if I had $1 million, why would I lend that to Wayne? Well, he might say, I have this brilliant business idea. You know, Wayne and Greg have this gene that just they want to be in business. I have this brilliant idea. I want to be in business, and I've got this idea. It will make you $10 million in return if you'll just front me the money. And here it is, and here are the details of it, and I have tested it, and I have proven it, and I've got a patent on it, and I've got a business plan, and here's how it works, and you'll recoup it in this amount of time. Okay. Why would I agree to that kind of a promise, that kind of an oath? Well, there's benefit in it for me, isn't there? I stand to make a profit. Now, God doesn't need to profit from us. If you're a parent, most of us are, have you ever lent anything to your kids? It's never the same when you get it back. There is a painful degree of truth in that, isn't there? How many of us as parents would prefer to just give something to our kids? I'd a whole lot rather just give it to them and be done with it. And in fact, financial counselors generally say in the parent-child relationship, it's not worth the stress and the hassle for a lot of people to have that contract and demand repayment. If you can't afford to give it, don't lend it. It's better to have good relations with your kids. But let's think about this in terms of God's relationship with us. Now, as parents, we give many things to our kids, don't we? Just outright. I mean, we give life, we give food, we give clothing, we give shelter. We give discipline. They don't necessarily want that, but it's good for them. We give gifts. Not so much because the kid wants it, they do, but because it gives us pleasure. Greg and Amy, y'all are gonna, your timing is perfect with those grandkids, because come Christmas, they're gonna be just almost old enough to start to begin to understand, oh goody. And the next year will be phenomenal as far as giving gifts to grandchildren. Plus you get to just skip right over the kids. You don't have to deal with them anymore. Why does God make promises to mankind? Go ahead, Joan. Okay, you're building a relationship, and God wants a relationship with us. And I just now realized when I see Nash standing out there that our class time is up. And I never did get to that fourth point, but that's all right. We'll do that later. But you're right. God wants a relationship with us. God even, just like our illustration with the Wayne and the $1 million, there's an incentive there on both ends. But God even sometimes gives us oaths to his people, and that takes us to Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 13. And that's where we'll have to stop this morning because our time is up. But we'll talk more about the promises of God as time goes by. Thank you for your attention and your participation.